Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. Recap of episode 5. Silveria's son started his professional journey at a prestigious oil firm, making steady progress and earning the respect of his colleagues. His determination to honor his mother's sacrifices fueled his success, and he began sending money home to support the family. Meanwhile, Venatius's world began to collapse as his dishonest business practices caught up with him. Clients abandoned him, creditors came knocking, and his wife, Amaka, grew increasingly frustrated with their declining lifestyle. The cracks in their relationship widened, with Amaka issuing an ultimatum that left Venatius isolated and desperate. In a surprising turn, Venatius showed up at Silveria's door, seeking help after losing everything. His plea for forgiveness and assistance created a moral dilemma for Silveria, as her son firmly opposed helping the uncle who had betrayed them. Now let's continue with episode 6. Silveria sat in her small living room, staring at the door Venatius had just walked out of. His desperate plea for help echoed in her mind. She had seen the broken man before her, the same brother who had betrayed her, stolen from her, and abandoned her son when they needed him most. Yet she couldn't ignore the look in his eyes, a mix of shame and hopelessness that tugged at her heart. "Mama, you can't be serious," her son said, pacing the room. "After everything he did to us, to you?" "He's not our problem," Silveria sighed deeply. She knew her son's anger was justified. Venatius had caused them immense pain, and his greed had nearly destroyed their lives. But she also knew the weight of family ties. "He's still my brother," she said quietly. "Your brother who stole from you," her son countered, his voice rising. "Who let his wife chase me out of their house like I was nothing." "He made his bed, Mama. Let him lie in it." Silveria leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. She had spent her life making sacrifices for her family, and the idea of turning away someone in need, even Venatius, felt wrong. "Forgiveness isn't for him," she said softly. "It's for us to heal and move forward." Her son stopped pacing and turned to her, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Mama, forgiveness is one thing. Letting him take advantage of you again is another." Silveria nodded, acknowledging his point. The decision weighed heavily on her. Could she find a way to help Venatius without sacrificing their hard-won stability? As the night deepened, so did her inner conflict, leaving her torn between compassion and justice. Silveria's son sat on the edge of his bed, his mind racing with thoughts of the day's events. He couldn't shake the image of Venatius standing at their door, pleading for help. It was a sight he had never expected to see. The man who had once flaunted his wealth and turned his back on their family now looked like a shadow of himself. He clenched his fists, the memories of Venatius's betrayal replaying in his mind. The inferior materials Venatius had supplied to his mother's salon, the humiliation he endured when Venatius's wife threw him out of their home, and the years of struggle they had faced because of Venatius's greed, all of it fueled his anger. "Mama is too forgiving," he muttered to himself. "She's always thinking about others, even when they don't deserve it." Despite his frustration, he couldn't ignore the small voice in the back of his mind that questioned his stance. Had Venatius truly learned his lesson? Could helping him now be a chance for their family to heal? But each time he entertained the thought, the weight of the past pushed it away. When Silveria came to check on him, she found him deep in thought. "You're still upset," she said gently. "Of course I am," he replied. "I don't want you to get hurt again, Mama. We've come too far to let him drag us down." Silveria sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I understand, my son, but sometimes life isn't just about who deserves what. It's about who we choose to be in the face of it all." Her words lingered in his mind long after she left the room, planting a seed of doubt in his unwavering resolve. Venatius sat on a bench in the quiet park near Silveria's home. His head hung low, his hands gripping the edge of the seat as if holding on for dear life. The weight of his failures was crushing. His lavish lifestyle, once the envy of many, was now a distant memory. His wife and children were gone, his business ruined, and his reputation shattered. For hours he replayed the moment at Silveria's door. Her stern but compassionate eyes had pierced through him. He hadn't expected her to listen, let alone entertain his plea for help. It was a humbling moment, one that forced him to confront the choices that had brought him here. His thoughts drifted back to the times he had wronged her. He remembered the money he had siphoned from her struggling salon, the inferior materials he had supplied, and the countless times he had dismissed her concerns as trivial. Worst of all, he had allowed his wife to humiliate Silveria's son, a boy who had trusted him. Tears stung his eyes as he realized the depth of his betrayal. "I don't deserve her kindness," he muttered under his breath. "I don't deserve anything." A gentle voice broke his thoughts. "Varnatius." He looked up to see Silveria standing a few feet away, her hands folded in front of her. "I brought you some food," she said, handing him a small container. He hesitated before taking it, his hands trembling. "Silveria, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," she replied. "Just eat." As she turned to leave, Venetius called out, "I'm sorry." "For everything." Silveria paused, her back to him. "You'll have to prove it," she said simply, walking away. Her words lingered, leaving Venetius with a glimmer of hope and a heavy task ahead. For the first time in years, Venetius woke up with a sense of purpose. Silveria's words the night before had struck a chord deep within him. "You'll have to prove it." He didn't know how, but he was determined to make things right, not only for her but for himself. Venetius began his day by seeking small ways to atone for his past mistakes. He walked through the same streets where he had once paraded his wealth, now humbled and unnoticed. His first stop was a hardware store where he purchased cleaning supplies using the little money he had left. With those in hand, he made his way to Silveria's salon. When he arrived, Silveria was surprised to see him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cautious but not unkind. "I came to help," Venetius said simply, holding up the cleaning supplies. "It's the least I can do." Silveria hesitated for a moment, studying his face. She saw no trace of the arrogance that had once defined him, only humility and sincerity. "All right," she said, "but don't expect this to change anything overnight." For the rest of the day, Venetius scrubbed floors, cleaned shelves, and organized the salon's supplies. He worked silently, occasionally stealing glances at Silveria as she attended to her clients. Her resilience was remarkable, and it filled him with both admiration and guilt. As the sun set, Venetius stood in the doorway, his hands sore but his heart lighter. "Thank you for letting me help," he said quietly. Silveria nodded, her expression unreadable. "It's a start," she replied before locking up for the night. For Venetius, it was indeed a start, a small step on the long road to redemption. Silveria's son returned home for the weekend, eager to spend time with his mother and younger sibling. As he stepped into the house, the sight of Venetius cleaning the yard stopped him in his tracks. He stood frozen watching his uncle, a man who had once looked down on them, on his knees, pulling out weeds with a worn brush and bucket by his side. "What is he doing here?" Silveria's son asked, his tone sharp as he walked into the house. Silveria sighed. She had expected this reaction. "He's trying to make amends," she said gently. "Amends?" he scoffed. "You really think pulling weeds will erase everything he's done? Mama, you can't trust him. People like him don't change." Silveria looked at her son, her expression calm but firm. "He's broken my son. He's lost everything. And he's trying, even if it's small steps. I know it's hard to forgive, but holding on to anger will only hurt us in the end." Her son shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Mama, I don't want to see you get hurt again. Forgiveness is one thing, but letting him back into our lives is another. You deserve better." Later that evening, Venetius approached Silveria's son, wiping his hands on a rag. "I know you don't trust me," he began hesitantly, "and I don't blame you, but I'm here to make things right." Silveria's son glared at him, the pain of the past still fresh. "Words mean nothing, Venetius. If you want my trust, you'll have to earn it." "And that's not going to be easy." Venetius nodded, his face solemn. "I'll do whatever it takes." As the tension hung heavy between them, Silveria watched from the doorway, praying that time would heal their wounds. The following days were a test of Venetius's resolve. Each morning he arrived at Silveria's salon before it opened, armed with cleaning supplies and a quiet determination. He swept the floors, scrubbed the counters, and even repaired a broken chair in the waiting area. He worked tirelessly, often in the presence of Silveria's skeptical clients, who whispered among themselves. "Isn't that her brother? The one who ruined her business?" one client murmured. "Yes," another replied. "It's about time he faced some consequences." Though Vernatius heard the whispers, he kept his head down and focused on his tasks. For every sneer, he responded with a polite nod or a quiet "good morning." Silveria, watching from behind the counter, noticed the changes in him. She didn't fully trust his intentions yet, but there was no denying that his humility seemed genuine. She occasionally gave him small tasks related to the business, testing his sincerity. When a delivery of supplies arrived one afternoon, Silveria handed him the invoice. "Make sure everything's in order," she said, her tone neutral. Vernatius carefully checked each item, double-checking the list before signing off. He returned the invoice to Silveria, his expression serious. "Everything's accounted for," he said. As the days passed, Vernatius' consistent efforts began to soften some of Silveria's initial wariness. However, her son remained unconvinced. One evening, after a long day at work, he confronted Silveria. "Mama, how can you just let him back in like this?" he asked. Silveria met his gaze, her voice calm. "Because I believe people can change. And if he's willing to work for redemption, who are we to deny him that chance?" Her words lingered in her son's mind as he struggled to reconcile his anger with the possibility of forgiveness. The first glimmer of progress came unexpectedly. Silveria's salon had a few loyal clients who had stayed despite the previous issues with inferior products. One of them, Mrs. Adiola, noticed Vernatius diligently working in the background. "Silveria," she said, leaning forward in her chair, "your brother seems to be putting in a lot of effort." "I never thought I'd see him like this." Silveria paused, her hands busy braiding Mrs. Adiola's hair. "He's trying," she admitted, "but only time will tell if it's enough." That day, Vernatius completed a list of tasks Silveria had given him, including painting the salon's front door. As he stepped back to admire his work, a young client approached him. "Are you the handyman?" she asked innocently. "No," Vernatius replied, a small smile forming on his lips. "I'm just helping my sister." Silveria, watching the interaction from inside, felt a faint flicker of hope. Though she remained cautious, the sight of Vernatius humbling himself gave her a sense of validation. She had always believed in second chances, even when others doubted her. Her son, however, remained distant. That evening, while they shared a quiet dinner, he finally broke his silence. "Mama, I still don't trust him," he said bluntly. "I don't expect you to," Silveria replied. "Trust isn't given freely, it's earned. And Vernatius knows that." Her son nodded, though his expression remained guarded. The wounds Vernatius had inflicted were deep, but for the first time he wondered if they could be healed. Vernatius, unaware of these conversations, continued to show up each day. With every task he completed, he took another small step toward earning back the trust he had shattered. Silveria stood in her small kitchen, preparing a pot of stew. The aroma filled the house, and the sound of bubbling broth provided a comforting background as she thought about the events of the past few weeks. Vernatius's presence had been a source of tension, especially with her son, but his consistent efforts had begun to soften the edges of her mistrust. As she stirred the pot, she thought about the power of small gestures. Vernatius had been humbled in ways she never imagined possible, but he still had a long way to go. Silveria decided to offer a gesture of her own, not as forgiveness, but as a way to show him that redemption was possible. Later that evening, after the salon had closed, she called Vernatius into the house. He hesitated at the door, unsure if he was welcome, but Silveria waved him in. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the dining table. On the table was a simple meal of rice and the stew she had prepared. "You've been working hard," she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "You should eat." Vernatius's throat tightened as he sat down. "Thank you, Silveria," he said quietly. He picked up the spoon and took a bite, the warmth of the meal filling him in more ways than one. As they ate in silence, Silveria finally broke it. "You've made a start, Vernatius, but actions speak louder than words. If you're serious about making things right, it won't be easy." "I know," he replied, his voice steady. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Silveria nodded. Good, because this family has endured enough. If you want to be part of it again, you'll need to prove that you deserve it. The weight of her words hung in the air, a challenge that Vernatius silently accepted. Tensions in the house had reached a boiling point. Silveria's son, who had reluctantly accepted Vernatius's presence, finally confronted him. It happened late one evening when they were both in the living room and Silveria had stepped out to run an errand. "What are you really doing here?" Silveria's son asked, his tone sharp. "Do you think scrubbing floors and painting doors will fix everything you've done?" Vernatius set down the broom he was holding and looked at his nephew. "No," he said quietly, "I don't expect it to, but I have to start somewhere." "Start somewhere?" The younger man scoffed. "Do you even realize what you put us through? My mother worked herself to the bone because of you. I had to squat in a dilapidated house because you let your wife throw me out. And now you want us to believe you've changed?" "I don't expect you to believe anything," Vernatius replied, his voice steady. "But I'm trying, not for your forgiveness, but because I need to face the man I've become. And I don't like what I see." The raw honesty in Vernatius' voice caught Silveria's son off guard. He didn't respond immediately, instead walking to the window and staring out into the night. "It's not that simple," he said after a long pause. "You don't get to waltz back into our lives and pretend everything's fine." "I'm not pretending," Vernatius said, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm here to make amends, no matter how long it takes." When Silveria returned, she found the two men sitting in silence on opposite ends of the room. She could sense the tension but chose not to address it directly. Instead, she silently hoped that time would bridge the gap between them. The tension between Silveria's son and Vernatius had hung like a storm cloud for weeks, but neither could avoid the inevitable confrontation. Silveria, sensing the need for resolution, invited both men to the dinner table one evening. Her tone was firm but calm as she set the plates down. "We're a family, whether we like it or not," she began. "And families don't heal by avoiding the hard conversations. Tonight we talk." Both men exchanged wary glances but stayed silent. Silveria took a deep breath. "Vernatius, I've seen your efforts, but you've caused this family a lot of pain. My son has every right to feel the way he does." "You need to acknowledge that," Vernatius nodded, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I do. I've thought about it every day since I lost everything. I let greed and pride blind me, and I betrayed the people who mattered most. I know an apology isn't enough, but I am truly sorry." Silveria's son stared at him for a long moment. "Sorry doesn't undo what you did. You stole from us. You left me to fend for myself when I needed help the most. Do you have any idea what that was like?" "I don't," Vernatius admitted, his voice breaking. "And I'll never be able to make up for it. But I want to try. I want to be better for this family, for myself." The room fell silent. Silveria's son finally spoke, his voice softer. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I'll think about it." It wasn't the reconciliation Silveria had hoped for, but it was a start. As they ate in relative peace, she allowed herself a small glimmer of hope for the future. Stay tuned for episode 7, The Road to Forgiveness. Will Vernatius earn back the trust he lost, or will the wounds of the past prove too deep to heal? Catch episode 7 tomorrow at 7 p.m. Don't miss the next chapter of this gripping story. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.